We're going to go ahead and start with the next session, and I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and to everyone watching. This is the SAR 2020 Global Congress in virtual format. We're going to go ahead and begin with this session, which is called Academic Freedom, Free Expression, and Civil Discourse. My name is Chelsea Blackburn-Cohen, and I'm a Senior Program Officer for North America at Scholars at Risk. And before we get started, we're just going to do a few housekeeping items here, so bear with me. Due to the compressed schedule of the virtual Congress, we hope that you understand that our Q&A may be limited, but we do welcome questions through that feature. So please be submitting questions during the session as we go, and we'll try to address those at the end. You can also submit those questions anonymously. That works best for you. And if you can't access the Q&A portal, please email scholarsAtRisk@nyu.edu as we are monitoring the inbox. We also encourage all of you to contribute to the social media conversation in parallel with the sessions. So share your favorite quotes and ideas and questions over Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and make sure to tag Scholars at Risk and use the hashtag SAR Congress 2020. For those of you who are unable to attend all the sessions, don't worry, we are recording the entire Congress and we'll make the sessions available for later review. And finally, just a reminder that over the coming weeks, we'll be exploring the possibility of rescheduling the in-person elements of the Congress for later in the year. And would invite you to mark your calendars for later on November 16th through 20th in New York City, and more information on that's to follow. So again, the title of the session is Academic Freedom, Free Expression, and Civil Discourse. All of our panelists here are based in the United States, but the significance of this content is by no means bound by geography. I'm pleased to be serving as the moderator for this session, so without further delay, please allow me to introduce our reputable panelists with me today. So first, I'd like to introduce Michelle Deutchman. She is the inaugural Executive Director of the University of California National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. In this role, Deutchman oversees a multidisciplinary national fellowship program and works across all 10 UC campuses to study and shape national discourse around free speech. Before joining the center, Deutchman served as the Western States Civil Rights Council and National Campus Council for the Anti-Defamation League, which is a nonprofit organization that has been a leader in combating bigotry and prejudice for over a century. Welcome, Michelle. Dr. Henry Hank Reichman is Professor Emeritus of History at California State University, East Bay. He's also the chair of the American Association of University Professors, AAUP, Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure. He's the AAUP's second vice president and chair of the AAUP Foundation. His book, The Future of Academic Freedom, was published last year by Johns Hopkins University Press, and it recently won the biennial L.I.M. Obler Memorial Award from the American Library Association. This award recognizes the best work on intellectual freedom published in the preceding 2 years. Thanks for joining us, Hank. Next, I'd like to introduce Lara Schwartz. Lara founded and directs the Project on Civil Discourse at American University. In addition to teaching government, policy, and law, she promotes universal design for learning and provides guidance to educators on incorporating dialogue across difference into learning communities. She is the co-author of How to College, What to Know Before You Go and When You're There, a practical guide to the college transition. Welcome, Lara. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nancy Thomas, who directs the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education at Tufts University. IDHE is an applied research center that centers on advancing student political learning, discourse, equity, participation, and democracy. Her research interest includes student civic learning and participation in democracy, including voting, campus climates for political engagement, speech, inclusion and academic freedom, and deliberative democracy on campuses. She is the author of multiple book chapters, articles, and the monograph, Educating for Deliberative Democracy. She received her law degree from Case Western Reserve University School of Law and her doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So I thought that we would just start by having an open question for all of the panelists. And I just wanted to start by getting a better sense and sharing the work that you do as it relates to the theme of this panel. Increasingly, we are witnessing contentious events on campuses across the country and around the world that evoke discussions of free expression, civil discourse, and academic freedom. Can each of you briefly share a little bit more about the context of your work in this area and what you think is particularly important about this moment?
I can start. The AAUP has been, for over a century now, founded in 1915, has defined freedom to teach, freedom for research, and freedom of citizens for, well, as I said, for 100 years. In recent years, our concerns have been focused in particular on the broader assault on expert knowledge and on the efforts to harass faculty members for their speech. And then finally, and in some ways most important, the erosion of the tenure system that has been the strongest defense for academic freedom in the United States, to the point now that only about a quarter of those who teach in higher education are even in the system, much less have tenure.
I'm happy to go next. Thanks, Chelsea, for putting together this great panel. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. So I think a lot of people probably know that the University of California is regularly associated with free speech and, you know, the free speech movement. We all know that iconic picture, right, of Mario Savia on Sproul Plaza. And so, you know, there was a lot of things, as Chelsea mentioned, that have been happening on college campuses around the country, and many of those things took place on UC campuses. In particular, 2017, Milo Yiannopoulos visited, and it resulted in, you know, property damage and violence. And President Napolitano decided to form the center, the National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, as sort of a way of setting aside time, space, resources, and energy to focus in a really deliberative and thoughtful way about speech and civic engagement related issues. And I think one of the keys is this idea of trying to create, like I said, a space where we're not just being reactive to things that are happening in real time, but to try to be proactive, to be looking around and at the space and at who's in doing the work and saying, okay, what's missing? How can the University of California and its center fill those things in? And so one of the key things that we've been doing is we have a National Fellows Program. I'm happy to brag that Lara Schwartz is one of our current fellows. We have these 10 brilliant people who are thinking about ways to navigate the kind of in the field treacherous waters. And the vision of the center, I think, is a very pragmatic one, where people will hopefully be creating resources that folks in higher education, not just at the University of California, but across the nation will be able to utilize as we work together, you know, in this moment of trying to change campus climate and change the narrative.
I can go ahead, I guess. So I founded and direct the project on civil discourse at American University. I'm a lawyer and I do teach constitutional law. I teach about the First Amendment and free speech. However, I find that that conversation is inadequate to our moment on campuses, and it's not consistent entirely with what universities are about. Universities are about seeking knowledge in pursuit of our betterment and our shared public interest. And the First Amendment isn't a blueprint for that or for how to live or how to be in a community. It is simply a limitation on government action. So at the project on civil discourse, we ask students to be the architects of their voice, which is their collected body of inquiry, listening, learning, reading, and be responsible for how they use all of that. We do that through peer-led discussions on important topics like, can you be friends with your roommate with whom you disagree? Or does it matter if your professor disagrees with you? Or what is forgiveness? What is the nature of true apology? And as well, because I do believe in looking at discourse, not as a bunch of ideas that are limitations on freedom, but that are part of our academic endeavor of doing things well in connection with concrete objectives and purpose and neutral principles of excellence, to look at as well, help my fellow faculty to incorporate discourse, connected, productive discourse into their learning communities as a skill to be obtained and mastered and celebrated as a college level skill.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Thomas, and I'm happy to be here. Nice to see everybody's face on this panel. I work at Tufts University. I run a research institute called the Institute for Democracy in Higher Education. It is an applied research center, and in so few words, we're pretty worried about the state of democracy in the United States, and we're studying how students learn about it on college campuses. We look at all things political. So, for example, we look at the state of discourse and our ability to talk to each other, not only across differences of social identity, but also ideology. We study student participation in democracy and have the largest study in the United States on college student voting, which is an interesting project because then it gives us a sort of an outcome of an education that we can work backwards from and try to reconstruct the student experience that might beget that outcome. We also look at campus climates, and we have done quite a few campus climate studies for political learning and engagement, and have been looking at some of the attributes of highly political and effectively political campuses. We've looked at things like, what are the structures that these campuses support? What are the norms and behaviors? What do faculty members do in the classroom that seems to be particularly effective? What are the challenges that they face? And of course, these issues that we're talking about today are first and foremost on the minds of faculty members when they are in the classroom and frankly beyond. What are some of the pressures facing the universities, particularly along the lines of legislative intervention or funding cuts, things like that. So we look at all of these issues, and then because it's an applied shop, we try to provide the higher education community with practical tools and resources that they can use to facilitate change.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone, for giving us that more context into the wonderful work that you're doing. I'm going to direct the first question to Hank. Hank, we often discuss free expression and academic freedom in terms of its limits and extensions. For instance, academic freedom in more authoritarian societies, for example, or free expression extending to hate speech. What's missing from this conversation, and how can we make it a more robust dialogue during a time when we are witnessing these increasing attacks on expert knowledge, as you began your statement today?
Well, I think the I think that there's a lot of confusion today between the idea of am I being heard? Yeah, okay, because I'm not center on the screen. So there's a lot of confusion today between the idea of academic freedom and the idea of freedom of speech. A lot of people think that academic freedom is just simply a kind of freedom of speech, and they don't recognize that, in fact, free speech is a right that all citizens have. Academic freedom is, in a certain sense, a privilege that those in the teaching and research professions have earned and have to exercise with a certain degree of responsibility. And the problem has become that free speech is sometimes now being used as a hammer in order to attack academic freedom. So, for instance, people complain that, well, in a climate study class, that a student who doesn't believe in that climate change is humanly caused, that person has the right to just sort of say that that's the truth. Well, they have the right, certainly, to hold that opinion or even to argue it outside of the classroom, but they don't have the right to answer a question on the exam that denies the science that's supposed to be taught in the class. That is not their freedom. And now the complication here is, of course, that the AAUP has always argued that academic freedom is not only freedom in the classroom and in research, but also is the freedom of the scholar to speak as a citizen, which is a kind of overlap with free speech. But it's not quite the same. And for example, I'm a historian of 20th century Europe, and I do not have the freedom to argue in my classes that the Holocaust didn't happen. But Holocaust deniers outside in the public do have that right. They make fools of themselves, if you ask me, and they're absolutely wrong. But if someone's willing to publish such an op-ed, that can be published. But if I were to start teaching that in my class, my colleagues would rightly raise some questions about whether I was qualified and fit to teach. So I think that the relationship between academic freedom and freedom of speech is that I think it's hard to imagine a campus where the freedom of speech of students is limited, where then the academic freedom of faculty is not also limited. Students should have freedom of speech, the freedom to criticize the institution, to protest, to even criticize and protest against their faculty members. But the faculty actually, in a certain sense, our freedoms in the classroom and in our scholarship are in a certain sense more limited by our professional responsibilities.
Great, thank you, Hank. I think that segues perfectly into the question actually that I was hoping to direct to you, Michelle. You know, in your work, it seems that you get both a bird's eye view and an on-the-ground view of how the rights and responsibilities of free expression are interpreted and valued and how they're currently unfolding across campuses. But you also cite the importance of changing the narrative to highlight how the value of free expression is complementary to other values. So I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about why this is so important and what other values play a critical role here.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. I mean, I think piggybacking first on what Hank said, I think not only is there misunderstanding about free speech versus academic freedom, but I think there's a lack of civic literacy. And while I agree with, as a lawyer myself, also I agree with Lara that I think the First Amendment is a very blunt instrument and doesn't give us a blueprint. I do think that one of the issues that we encounter is that students arrive at college and they don't have the foundations. And so that's obviously a topic for another time, but I think that has to be mentioned. I think another key that I see from sort of the 50,000-foot view is this idea that when people talk about free speech, they're talking about it in a very singular way. It is a singularly important value. It is the most important value. It's in the First Amendment, you know, so the argument goes. And I think in doing that, what they do is they end up isolating speech and they talk about it in a vacuum. And I think while we can do that in a theoretical way, I don't think that's how it works on the ground, because I think at universities, speech is interwoven into institutional life, along with other values like respect, like fairness, like inclusion, like diversity. And I think that in addition to talking about it in a vacuum, I think when people do talk about speech in the context of other values, they're talking about how they're in conflict with one another. There's this polling question that sort of makes me apoplectic, asking students whether they would choose a university with robust expression or with equity and inclusion. And I think that's a misguided question, and it creates a dangerous narrative. Now, are the values always in precise alignment? Of course not. But are they always at loggerheads? And I think that answer is no. And that framing it in a way, a paradigm where people have to choose one or the other, I think ultimately just increases the polarization that we're already seeing, not just on campuses, but in society at large. And I think instead, I think the focus should be on discussing and experimenting with how the values can complement each other. And that's part of the work of what the center is doing. The other thing I kind of want to mention has to do with this issue of when people talk about speech in the First Amendment, it's always focusing a lot on the rights. We have the right to say things that are hateful, offensive, you know, inaccurate, rude, mean, and there just isn't as much focus, I don't think, on the responsibilities piece of using the right. Just because the law permits you to say something doesn't mean that you should. And I think in K through 12 education, and certainly as a parent myself, I know I spend a lot of time talking about the value of words. And I think that we still need to be emphasizing that responsibility piece, even in the college setting. And, you know, I think that there's a role for staff and administrators and faculty to guide and educate students about the responsibility of using the First Amendment. You know, I think obviously the courts treat K through 12 really differently than college students who are kind of grown up and independent. But I'll just share one brief story that I think really highlights what I think we could see more of on campuses, which is at UCLA in 2018. The college Republicans wanted to bring Milo Yiannopoulos to campus. And of course, they're allowed to do that. And a conservative faculty member at UCLA wrote a letter encouraging them not to do it. And what he wrote was, as one of the few conservative faculty at UCLA and one of a very few who knows this campus club, I feel obligated to provide some mentorship here, and I strongly urge you to rescind your invitation. And then he went on to explain why, talking a lot about kind of what Hank said, the lack of, that he's a provocateur, the lack of using reason. And then he finally said, you know, if your mission is to spread conservative ideas, you should recognize that this is going to just render the ideas of your group toxic. And if you go through with it, he again made this distinction. He said, I'll support your right to do so and the duty of the UCPD to use force if necessary to maintain order. He said, but I will publicly disagree with your decision to host, and I will basically decline association with your group again. And ultimately, the group decided not to host Yiannopoulos. And we'll never know whether that faculty's letter was a reason or the reason, but I think it showcases how rights, responsibilities, and social consequences are an important part of these campus speech issues. And that professor modeled how to think critically about all three of those. And I want to add that, like, whether you're left, right, or center, I think that we need more people willing to play this role in the campus setting.
Excellent. Thank you, Michelle. And with that, I'm going to turn to the other lawyer here on the panel, and also to get a view of what that's like in the classroom. So this question here is for Lara. Part of your work focuses on the necessity of these paradigm shifts, similar to what Michelle was getting at when we're thinking about these issues. Can you talk a little bit about the paradigm shifts that are part of your work and what is most misunderstood about free expression and civil discourse and or academic freedom as they relate to this key role that higher education plays towards society that you had shared in your opening statement?
Sure. So thank you. Yeah, when I founded the project on civil discourse a couple of years ago, and I was actually introducing it early on at the UC Free Speech Center Speech Matters conference, I said one of the operative sort of philosophical underpinnings comes from Jurassic Park, where the Jeff Goldblum character says, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. Which is the paradigm shift from, am I allowed to do this? Can some external authority figure stop me, right? You can't stop me is not an ideal career development plan versus, you know, what should I do? And so that's sort of the plan. It's really getting students focused on this paradigm shifts from rights to responsibilities. But in terms of the underlying misconception, as I've had time to think about it, one of the things that's become apparent to me is that what we have is a misconception where we conflate the burdens of free speech with its benefits. And it goes something like this. We have two sort of strains of thought on free speech. We have the legal cases like Snyder v. Phelps, where this horrible group that is protesting a fallen Marine's funeral saying God hates fags, right? And they can do this because they're on a sidewalk, they're in a place they can do this. Cases like Brandenburg v. Ohio, which protects the right of the KKK to march. So these are groups that nobody thinks contribute to our body politic in a way that we're proud of and need, much like the Holocaust deniers that my colleague mentioned. And we also have this idea of the marketplace of ideas, which is very closely intertwined with this academic freedom component of our conversation. Getting ideas out and in conversation with one another can be a great thing. And in the context of universities, we have academic freedom so that we can do this job of generating ideas and science and theories in the public interest, even in the face of them being unpopular at a given time, which Michelle alluded to the free speech movement, and as well AAPUP's origins in protecting this idea generation component, right? But the thing is that this we can't let the government stop us even from doing terrible things. And we need this freedom to do great things. They're not of a piece. They're not the same. And what you get is this conflation where you get trolls like Milo and race eugenicists, quasi-scientists coming to campus, and really obnoxious speech in the classroom and behavior in the classroom that makes some students, feel like they don't belong there, right? Being thrown into this marketplace of ideas concept and saying, this is good stuff. So even though the Supreme Court hasn't said we need and desire the KKK and the Westboro Baptist Church, they've said we can't be free in a system that excludes them. That's not what's going on at universities. So first of all, as my colleague on the panel said, academic freedom applies to people who have actually already met neutral academic standards, come in through the processes of, education, peer review, tenure. And at the student level, right, we actually have an application process for students. If you spent all of AP chemistry, doodling pictures of anatomy, you're not maybe coming to college. So academic freedom and the free speech rights and the academic rights of conscience of students are different from trolling, but we treat them as if they're the same. We lump them in together. So for me, the paradigm shifts that need to result from a recognition that the burdens and benefits of free speech are different, right? And that these two strains legally always belong separately, is to do these three paradigm shifts. So one Michelle alluded to, the rights to responsibilities shift from the you can't stop me, which is a rights paradigm, to what can I do in my best interest, in our shared interest. From combat to collaboration, students are students. They're trying to learn. I'm often asked to come to campuses and teach people how to engage better in civil debate. And I say, hang on, could I come instead and get your students interested in loving the questions themselves? And that's become a motto of our program, from Rilke's letter to the young poet, love the questions themselves as if they were books. Civil debate presumes some degree of certainty and expertise that's not warranted among college students. We'd rather get to collaborative questioning. And finally, a paradigm shift from thinking about, in particular, calls for inclusion, diversity, respectfulness across, for example, demographic or identity difference. Stopping this dialogue where we're saying that these are limitations on freedom, and saying instead, these are invitations to become a more skilled communicator, right? Which is what universities are actually about, is getting good at different skills that are hard. One of which is communicating with people respectfully in a community where there are people who have different sort of identities, needs, experiences, trauma backgrounds, and personal goals than yourself. And the last one is to a paradigm shift from thinking of our students and the people in these learning communities as sort of entitled snowflakes who are hostile to speech, to people who have been brought up in a K-12 environment that is a heavily speech-limited, speech-regulated environment in which they're encouraged to call out and reject what's considered bullying and exclusionary. Right? And so instead of saying we've got to wring our hands because students don't like freedom the way that we do, because they often really reject, the idea that racist speech, for example, belongs in a university. Instead, consider them to be products of the K-12 education system that we've put them in, that permits a lot of regulation on everything from whether they wear short shorts to what kind of political t-shirt they can wear, and meet them there.
Thank you, Lara. And I'm really looking forward to directing the conversation to Nancy and hearing more about her work with the campus climate. But before I do so, we are starting to get questions into the Q&A, and I think there's one that segues quite well to what you were just saying, Lara. And that's a question about how to deal with requests for safe spaces at universities. If you could address that quickly.
I can talk about that for a minute. I mean, I think this notion of safe spaces is kind of a red herring in some respects. First of all, universities, without calling them safe spaces, have safe spaces all the time. The classroom is a safe space for the discussion of whatever that classroom is about. It's not a free marketplace for anyone's ideas. You can't just, moreover, a dormitory. There's all sorts of a very important part of education is what goes on without faculty among students, where they have discussions among themselves, either of their classes, of contemporary events, etc. And they can be free to have them, but it's also their home. It's a safe space. It's a place where at some point a student has to be able to say, I'm closing my door now because I got to get some work done. And that's true also for faculty, for everybody else. So I think that the universities are filled with safe spaces. And the real question is, what is appropriate in what place? I think certainly since Berkeley's free speech movement, and I got my PhD at Berkeley, so I'm very fond of its traditions. Ever since then, the notion has been that there must be at least a place on campus, not necessarily some designated free speech zone, but a sense on the campus that students and other members of the campus community can gather, can protest, can organize politically, socially, culturally, can invite speakers of their choosing, etc. But that's not the same as saying that every place on campus has got to be open to that at every given moment. So I think there's been something of a red herring on the safe spaces issue. Everybody need safe spaces to gather their thoughts, to put together their ideas, and then go out into the open world where these ideas are debated and discussed.
Following upon that, before we all became people who live in our workplace 24/7, I would make the point that faculty, pundits and New York Times columnists, other people who aren't college students on residential campuses, all go to safe spaces, kind of every evening. And you have a place you can count on where the only people who think your ideas are sort of idiotic and worthless are your own kids, right? And college students don't have that who in residential universities. And the capacity to be able to say, since I am in this completely immersive environment, there have to be places that it isn't like that. It doesn't feel like statements that somehow if you allow a safe space, it's not like the real world. In the real world, we actually aren't allowed to sort of harass in workplaces at the level that campus trolling and campus exchange of ideas permits. But I think this idea of students seeking something that other people don't have and that's unreasonable is really off for that reason. But I think it also gets back to this question of what's worthwhile and what's valuable on campuses. What I've seen is that there's this complete lack of understanding that when you hear people say, college is about being uncomfortable. Well, there's productive discomfort and there's unproductive discomfort. So when I've done a grad school orientation session on this topic of discourse geared to people who are going to be teaching assistants, it was a really rainy day. People were soaked. And I was like, how many of you have wet feet? How many of you think that your soaked sneakers are going to help you live more, kind of argue more robustly and learn better? And nobody said yes. And there are kinds of discomfort like, oh, wow, my worldview has been challenged and I'm struggling to incorporate why I can simultaneously feel the burn and realize that this economist has a point is productive. But there's some stuff like having wet shoes that we all just have to realize is a burden of being around people, but isn't really helping. And racist microaggressions, things like that, I would say we could say fall into that category. They're not bettering us.
Thank you to you both. And I want to move on to ask a question for Nancy, which I think pulls all of this together when we think about what the campus climate is today and how it's evolving. And so Nancy, you've applied a lot of the themes that we're discussing today to research on campus climate. And I was wondering if you could talk about the recent sociopolitical climate and how it has impacted the varying ways that we as students and staff and faculty experience and understand free expression and academic freedom on campus.
Sure. So there's campus climate before coronavirus, there's campus climate during the coronavirus, and then there's probably going to be campus climate after. So let me talk a little bit about what happened before. I agree with what everybody has been saying. I think it's very interesting. What we did is we went to campuses, as I said, they were highly politically engaged, and we looked at a bunch of attributes of those campuses. And I'll just give you some examples of our findings. So, for example, one of the structures that we saw repeatedly at campuses that do this well, the this being speech, inclusion, and academic freedom, is that they offer first year or Common Core experiences that all students take. On one campus, it was junior year because the institution brought in a lot of community college transfers. And so they offered this course. And these courses were often, communications 101 or even rhetoric classes, but they taught students how to frame issues, how to take all perspectives on an issue, how to argue the other side, how to present, how to write, how to advocate. And in it were these best practices of communication and deliberation and dialogue. And these were taught. At the same time, the professors were offered the opportunity, and many took the opportunity to learn how to do discussion-based teaching. How do you manage conflict in a classroom? How do you bring out ideas that are not in the classroom? How do you make sure that somebody is not feeling like an only? And then what are those little tiny pedagogical choices that you make in a moment that can make or break the climate in a classroom? For example, how do you word a question? Why did you say that? Or why'd you say that? Just the way we use our tone of voice can really affect a classroom and the ability of all students to learn equally. So those were some of the structures. In terms of norms, one thing that struck me, and by the way, when we went to these campuses, it was qualitative research, we had the typical code book. We had to throw the code book out because what emerged from our studies they weren't in our original code book. A couple of things were, but most things weren't. And one of them was, what are these norms? And the norm that seemed to permeate these particular campuses was that we share responsibility for each other. And that was it was completely striking because the students would say, we just had a heated conversation about abortion. I can't stand that person. I can't stand their perspective on it, but I love that person. Never heard the word love so often. It's when we visited these campuses. And the other thing was shared responsibility among the faculty for the students. The students felt very cared for by the faculty. If they were suffering from housing insecurity or food insecurity, their professors backed them up. They said, how can we help? What can we do? They would stay late and work with the students. They would talk to the students at 10, 11 o'clock at night, and the students felt that the faculty had their backs. And this created a lot of trust on campus, this idea of shared responsibility that was not just between students, but between faculty, staff, and students. It was quite remarkable. In terms of behaviors, the number one behavior, and this was our highest frequency code for those of you who do qualitative research, this is what we saw the most, is that they talk politics everywhere, in the classroom, in the dorms, in the cafeteria. And these weren't water cooler conversations. These were, again, very intelligent, often structured conversations with standards. Last thing I'll mention is student voice. Students were taken very seriously at these institutions. I was interviewing a president at one, and in the middle, a student protest just happened spontaneously over a personnel decision, and the president looked at me and said, "Sorry, this is over. I got to go talk to the students." And he went down there and sat with the students for 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, what did he say? "Okay, what are you going to do about it?" He transferred some of the decision-making and solution-making back to the students. And that again, it gave them a high sense of belonging and trust, and that they were part of all aspects of this institution. So, but these were the outlier campuses. These are not what we saw. And so since then, we've been doing climate studies on campuses that aren't politically engaged or that are somewhere in the middle. And there we saw a lot of things that we didn't see on the high outlier campuses, such as timidity, fear on the part of faculty, fear of being videotaped without their knowledge, and then the segments of the videotape being blasted out. And then the legislature gets involved and says, you know, why is this person teaching there? These claims of liberal indoctrination on campus, that is a form of bullying. And frankly, there is absolutely no evidence to support the claim that students come in with their empty heads and then all this liberal indoctrination is poured into it and then they graduate. That is not happening. And in fact, the only study that I've read where it shows any shift is it shows a slight shift to the right. That the liberal indoctrination is actually an indoctrination to stop being so rigid about things. Okay, so what is happening now? Right now, what I'm being told, and of course we don't have data on this because it's right now, but I have been talking to a lot of campuses, and what they're saying is this is a fire hose. They are drinking from a fire hose. They have too many emails, too many pressures, too many things to think about, and this is not what they're thinking about right now. And we even put out a little survey saying, how can we help you? What do you need at this time? And they all wrote back and said, we don't need anything until May. Please don't give us anything more to think about or do. So I don't think that this is on everybody's minds, but I think if they don't start thinking about this fall, when the election season hits, it's not going to be pretty. And so it would be very smart for campuses to start thinking about these things, and for institutional leaders, particularly on the academic side of the house or in student affairs, to start thinking strategically about the campus climate that they're going to have during this election season and what they're going to do. Now, up until the coronavirus hit, I had been working with groups of presidents, and this was foremost on their mind. This was what they were worried about. Nancy, how do we increase political learning and engagement and participation and learning about civic life, and yet still keep our campus from either getting in the news or blowing up? And we don't want either of those scenarios. Right now, I think there may be even some relief that people are not on campus having these kinds of problems, but I think we need to think about it.
I'd like to pick up on something that Nancy just said, when she talked about the importance of the faculty being involved in working with students. And I couldn't agree more. I think that we have a responsibility, not just, I mean, our job doesn't begin and end in the classroom. I mean, we're not just passively, handing over knowledge to students and sort of pouring it into their brains and then going home. We have to engage with our students. But one of the big challenges for that, of course, is that a lot of what Nancy was talking about where it works, I'm guessing, are mainly at small liberal arts colleges or elite schools often. Well, I'm wrong then, but I know at most campuses right now, if 3/4 of the faculty are not even eligible for tenure, half of them are teaching part-time. Some of them are there maybe for 2 or 3 years. Some of them are teaching at 3 and 4 campuses. It's not their fault, but they are not in a position to provide that. And the attitudes that Nancy encountered at some places where people feel intimidated and frightened, well, if there's a tenured faculty member who feels intimidated and frightened by some of the harassment that goes on by these charges of indoctrination, imagine how it is for somebody who's on a semester-to-semester contract with a very poor salary, just trying to scrape by, hoping to get a permanent job somewhere and not rock the boat. And what kind of guidance are they in a position to give students, no matter how much they want to or are capable of? So this is a real concern, for me.
If I could just respond to that. So I hear you, and I think you're right, but the poster children for some of these strong relationships between students and faculty are state colleges and universities, particularly large ones, and community colleges. This was not a dynamic that we saw on some of the other campuses. Now, the small liberal arts campuses are set up for that, but that's not what we visited. We visited 2 small liberal arts colleges, lots of state colleges and universities, a couple of research ones, one research one that was open access, and several community colleges. So we hit them all. The other thing is that the adjuncts came out pretty well among students. They loved their adjuncts. They felt they've taught from experience, and adjuncts loved the side of teaching that had to do with being with students. So we didn't see that too much. If we saw it more related to the disciplines, and there are many disciplines where the idea of educating for civic life or teaching the policy sides of that discipline are viewed as beyond the scope. And that was where there were problems, I think, if we saw it anywhere. I want to go back to one other thing, though, real quick, that I think everybody has touched on, and that is the head-to-head collision course between academic freedom and free speech. I think Hank raised it first, and then Michelle and Lara have both sort of touched on it too. One of the problems I see right now with higher education is it's still trying to decide where academic freedom belongs. And it's about, right now it's being defined as almost reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Faculty have academic freedom to control their classroom, but the minute students step out of the classroom, there isn't academic freedom. I completely disagree with that. We now have 30 years of education research that says campus climates matter to learning, that it is the learning environment in its totality that affects a student's ability to thrive. And so we cannot assume that if we give academic freedom so that we can provide not just safe spaces, but robust exchanges for learning. If we can only do that in the classroom, we're going to lose the war. We're not going to be able to reach the students and provide them with equal learning opportunities. We've really got to have a national conversation, I think, about the importance of academic freedom to control the learning environment for students in every aspect of their learning, not just inside the classroom.
Thank you both for following up there. And we're running out of time, and I really wish we could continue this dialogue because it's been very robust. And luckily, actually, a lot of you have addressed some of the questions that are coming in through your conversation. So I'm also very grateful for that as the moderator. But I do want to try to close, and I would like to start with Michelle. We just have a few minutes, but as we're brought to this virtual space together from locations all over the world, and we contend with this singular crisis that is COVID-19 that Nancy has been discussing, how does it change our thinking about academic freedom and free expression in civil discourse? And what other challenges has it exposed?
Thanks, Chelsea. I think that is for those of us that are spending most of our time thinking about these issues all the time, I think that is the question. And, I think Nancy said it best in our pre-call, which is like sort of the jury is out. But I think all of the things that we're talking about, especially this idea of responsibilities and institutional values. I think a lot of those issues still remain the same. They just take a different format. So these questions about like fairness and equity and respect, how are we going to transform and transfer those into the online world? And I'll just raise a couple of things that come to mind for me, kind of echoing what Lara and I were talking about K through 12 and anti-bullying and anti-bias. You know, there's a lot of studies that show that not being face-to-face, people have a lack of empathy. And so I have some concerns that whatever trolling is already happening, I think one of two things is going to happen. It's going to be either end of the spectrum. Either people are going to feel empowered and emboldened to say things that they might not say to somebody's face in an in-person classroom situation, or I fear that the other thing will happen, which is that people will be chilled because they'll be afraid of somebody videotaping them or taking what they're saying out of context, and they'll feel as if maybe a better choice is just to say little or say nothing. So I think those are some of the questions. I mean, in addition to all of these ideas about learning opportunities and grading, you know, and what do you do if you don't have, you know, a fast internet connection, or your home is somewhere across the world and you can't get on, you know, with the 15-hour time difference. I think that there's, I think the principles are the same in the issues that we're encountering, but we have to apply them a little bit differently.
So I would just like to jump in. So, you know, two data points. One is that with the maybe we should all be working together by Easter and jamming the churches, it's very possible that one side of the political spectrum is in the process of potentially getting untold numbers of people killed. And another data point is that I've had 3 emails from a Koch-funded sort of academic think tanky group since we went online saying, hey, you want a grant to help you do this? So I anticipate if we get to be back in person in the fall, which I thought until the Easter idea, that the industry that exists to cast doubt on truth in order to produce fossil fuel consumers, and does this through attacks on academics and academia, will not have fallen out due to the economic dislocations of this time, and they will be back attacking, and will be, I teach government problem solving, and I'll be in the odd position of continuing to be in a place where there are people who honestly think, and some of them are employed by the New York Times op-ed page, people who honestly think that the problem that we have right now is that academics aren't super fair and nice and kind to those who are supporters of this president, right? And I'm term faculty, so Hank brought up to the contingency and precarity of the profession, so I'm a contract faculty member. So I teach against the backdrop of if a student presses a button that says, well, I don't like how she doesn't like what the president I likes, that is part of my continued employment, although principles of government and how to do things well in our public interest and our shared interests are opposite, right, to getting a bunch of people killed. And that is a problem, and it's going to remain a problem, and I would argue potentially even be a worse one when we all get back to it. Not to be Debbie Downer, but.
I want to just.
We've got about 2 minutes to split it up, so real quick.
Okay. Yeah. Just quickly, I just want to make 2 quick points. One is that we've learned a lot over the last several years about online teaching and learning and where it works, where it doesn't work, how to do it well. And I think we have to make very clear to everybody what people are being forced into right now is not online learning. It's a makeshift solution. Second thing I want to point out is that in this makeshift solution, we are particularly vulnerable to some of the things that Lara was talking about. It should be noted that Charlie Kirk, the head of Turning Point USA, the sponsor of the notorious professor watch list, which is a blacklist of liberal-leaning professors, tweeted out to his more than 1 million followers, use these online things to capture screenshots of being indoctrinated so we can expose these radical professors. So I think, we have to continue to be very vigilant. Academic freedom in the COVID environment is no less important than it was before and will be again when we're back in the classroom.
I just want to really quickly second all of that. I think it's super important. One of the things about that is important, an attribute of college, is social cohesion, our ability to collaborate, our ability to be part of a community of learners. And all of that is a challenge in this online learning time of online learning. And so maintaining our sense of social cohesion over the next 4 months is going to be pretty tough.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's tough for me to stop this right here, but I know we have to keep going. I really appreciate the rich dialogue. And sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions for everyone else who's out there attending right now. But we are really excited to begin our next session, which will begin momentarily, and it'll serve as our final plenary of the day with opening remarks from Dr. Catherine Stimson, Robert Quinn, and a conversation between Ronald Daniels and Dr. Jonathan Cole. So you will see the title card for the next session on your screen until it begins. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.